I think in a world where everyone eats with joy and dignity, there's still maybe a role to support that, to lift it up, to connect people with each other, where everyone can eat with joy and dignity. That there's joy, that people can experience the joy and sharing that we all have around food or that we should have around food. That is the ultimate goal, that everyone has access to those experiences and that relationship with the food that nourishes them. So yeah, my name is Josh. I'm the CEO of an organization called Food First NL. We're based in Newfoundland and Labrador, and our mandate is to advance the right to food in Newfoundland and Labrador, and that's a pretty big one, right? Our vision is a province where everyone can eat with joy and dignity, and we're obviously, I think, just like most of this country, pretty far from that vision right now. So, what our work looks like within that is we have four pathways we see towards getting to that mission. One of them is advocacy, of which we do quite a bit. The second one is organizing with our partners in the food movement. So there's hundreds of organizations here who are doing some kind of work on food. The third is taking action. So we run some programs ourselves on the ground, where it makes sense for us to fit in that more active role. And then the fourth is valuing people. And for us, that means valuing especially the voice of lived experience, folks who have a lived experience of food insecurity, but also valuing the voice of the people who work for Food First. So this kind of work is so intensely people driven that we really aim to bring those folks in and support them as best as we can, and we see that as a really important part of our success. That's a great question, and my answer shifts depending on the day, I think. But I think there's a couple of things that inspire me. One is that there is something special about doing this kind of work in a smaller province, right? So Newfoundland and Labrador, we have 500,000 odd people. There is sometimes a sense that change can happen quickly, and change can happen fluidly, and people can be responsive and connected in a way that's really challenging in a larger place. So I think the way I often think about it is that in our area of work, no province is doing enough to solve the problems that are here, but our province is doing more than most, and that does inspire me. I can go into conversations with decision makers, and I don't usually have to convince them of the importance of the work. I just have to convince them to spend the amount of money on it that they need to spend. But there's a different conversation than I would be having in lots of other places, and so I does feel whenever I read, for example, some partners commissioned public polling about the issues that we work on, and support for action is higher in Newfoundland and Labrador than anywhere else in Canada, right? Things like our organization does a lot of work on basic income, for example. 90% of people in this province support that. And so I think, just knowing that there is this grassroots of people who want this change to happen, and knowing that there's a system that at least in theory can allow it to happen quickly, and that we have some examples. So like this, Newfoundland and Labrador is the only province in recent history to have successfully reduced food insecurity, right? Wasn't that long ago. And so the fact that has already happened, that also really inspires me. And then like I think the other piece is just I mentioned this is really people driven work, and I'm always inspired. Our whole team is inspired by the people we get to work with. A lot of our time is spent trying to support folks at the grassroots in small organizations, making their projects happen. And so like we get to talk to all these hundreds of people all the time, and that's really helps keep kind of keep the energy going for us. So there's lots. This is really challenging work to do, right? So we're trying to solve a problem that is only solvable at the policy level, right? I run a nonprofit organization with just under 20 people, and we're trying to solve a social level problem, right? So I think one of the challenges that we run into is um, balancing advocacy to shift those larger structural pieces with the value of doing work on the ground and changing lives one by one or inspiring people to get involved, right? And I think like from our perspective, those two things aren't disconnected. That doing work on the ground brings people into the movement, it brings energy, it brings perspective, it grounds that policy level work in a way that I don't think would be nearly as authentic or effective if we couldn't validate some of that with our lived experience advisor group or with the people who come by to shop at our affordable food market, you know? But it is a real challenge, I think, finding that balance point between telling people, look, this is a problem that can only be solved at the kind of government policy level. Um, you don't want to use that to devalue work on the ground, but you also don't want to give people illusions about the how far ground level work can go, right? So managing that tension is always going to be a challenge for an organization like ours. But it also, I think there's some creative energy that comes out of naming that tension for sure, right? Uh, and you know, of course, we face the same kind of structural challenges that most nonprofits face, right? Like um, securing resources over more than 1 year is incredibly difficult. So it's hard to plan. You know, the structurally the nonprofit sector is set up in a way that really challenges our ability to be effective sometimes. That's certainly, you know, that's true for us as it would be for anybody. But I think the biggest one in those kind of menu of structural challenges is that um, there is not a lot of interest in the community of folks who resource work in our area to resource policy work, right? So it's much easier to fund your mobile food market, which is a program that I love, than it is to fund your work to push government to adopt more aggressive policy targets, which is also work that I love. And so, you know, I will plug Definity Foundation here because this has been where we are partnering, and I think that's really valuable because it's unfortunately pretty rare. And so, you know, we've been doing a lot of policy work from the side of our desks, and it's only in recent years, and especially now, that we're able to kind of center that and make it an official part of what we're doing. And I think for so many of our nonprofit partners, they haven't been able to find the space to get there. Ah, there's so much. So, as I mentioned earlier, I think like Atlantic Canada is kind of on the leading edge. That doesn't mean we solved this problem at all, but I think we're teed up to have the best chance of making impact on this, and particularly in Newfoundland and Labrador. There's a few things that are happening. Um, One is that the connection between health and some of these bigger social determinants, poverty, food insecurity, is being centered in a public policy way here more than I see it in many other places. So we went through a process called the Health Accord. It was meant to develop this kind of 10-year vision of health and healthcare in the province. I sat on the committee for it, actually. And the report that came out basically said there's no way to fix this without fixing those social determinants of health, that it's just not within the capacity of the healthcare system to solve this problem. And that report, you know, it recommended a basic income twice. It recommended action on mental health and addictions. It recommended all these kind of social level programs. And it recommended them for the area of the budget that is more than half of what any province spends, which is healthcare, right? So I think that centering social action within the healthcare space is, if you want to see action provincially, you have to do it, right? So we do have kind of some momentum built up there. We have a history of some effectiveness at poverty reduction in this province, which I think there's like kind of a memory of how to do it. Our politics are also less partisan around this particular issue than in lots of other provinces. So, for example, we have an all-party committee studying basic income right now. And if you had closed your eyes in a meeting of that committee, you would not have known who the New Democrat and who the Conservative was, right? And I think, not to say that everything is perfect in our politics, it's far from it. But there's more consensus around the need for action on some of these things than in a lot of other places. And then I think this is all kind of what's maybe structurally possible on the government side, which is something we pay attention to. But the other thing is that I think there's a lot of structural strength to the community right now. You know, we're seeing more and more partnership between community organizations with varying mandates, right? So we do tons of work with folks who work on housing, folks who work on employment, folks who work on violence against women. There's a lot of common ground and recognition that the factors that impact all of us. And there's just more willingness to work collectively. We're also seeing national partners really kind of willing to come to the table in provincial ways a little bit more lately. So just it feels like right now in Canada, and that's exciting to see. Yeah, we do. On the kind of structural side, we know a few things, right? I think we work in food insecurity. It is not as complex a problem as some of the other ones that our colleague organizations work on, right? We have lots of good data. We know that it's primarily an issue of insufficient incomes. We know where the gaps are. And so I think there's a few things that we're really prioritizing right now. One is that we would like our provincial government to set a target, a numerical target to reduce the rate of food insecurity in this province. Targets motivate action, they motivate accountability, and it would mirror the asks that lots of our peers have been making federally. So that's a really important one. We also need to see more action to support working age adults. So in our world, talking about access to food, there's been a lot of investment recently on children and youth and on seniors. But the biggest problem we're seeing is on adults 18 to 64, people who are really struggling, and there's just not a lot available for folks. So that's, I think, involves shifting the discourse that we have that's very judgmental about people in that position, right? But seeing some action on working age adult poverty and food insecurity is a huge one for us. And then seeing some movement. So our province is, I think, in many ways, along with Prince Edward Island, I'd say leading the way on really thinking through what a guaranteed basic income would look like and what that would mean socially. And seeing that continue to move is, I think, really important. And then the final, I think, area we really want to see some action right now is on transportation. And it's a funny thing to say here, but when we go out in community and ask people what is getting in the way of your right to food, I mean, the first thing people say is money, obviously, and the lack thereof. But the second thing people always say is around transportation and how people struggle to physically get where they need to go to get the food that makes sense for their household. And it's not an issue. We've traditionally taken that seriously in Newfoundland and Labrador. There's a kind of assumption that everyone has access to a car. And so shifting the way that we talk about that is a really high priority for Food First right now. Yeah, that's a good question. So we just went through, it's only a couple of years ago that we went through like a full top to bottom rewrite of our mission and vision. And so the one that we work with now, it still sits with me personally really strongly as an ultimate goal, which is that we should be in a province where everyone can eat with joy and dignity, right? So that means that this isn't just about calories, right? It's not just about making sure that people aren't food insecure in the sense of having something. It means that there's joy, that people can experience the joy and sharing that we all have around food or that we should have around food, that there's dignity to how they access that food. That is the ultimate goal, that everyone has access to those experiences and that relationship with the food that nourishes them, right? And I think, so that some people say that success would be putting themselves out of business, and I'm not sure that for Food First NL, I'm not sure that's true. I think in a world where everyone eats with joy and dignity, there's still maybe a role to support that, to lift it up, to connect people with each other. Like because we're not an emergency service per se, but we'd certainly love to be spending our time doing that instead of responding to what is like an urgent crisis. Yeah, I always have a few. I mean, I think one of them is that, and this is always a call to action, that like elected officials need to hear about this. I worry that we are becoming numb to this parade of depressing statistics about access to food. So, in our province, food insecurity has doubled in the last 7 years, right? And it's gotten to the point where everyone expects that number to go up. And so I think the call to action here is to not let that kind of expectations set in, and not to let this become just something that we assume is always going to be true. And to share that with the people who are making decisions, right? Reach out whenever someone is asking, and for your support politically, to bring this up as an issue, right? Like I think that has to be a part of this, and I think for folks who are involved with community organizations, we have a fair bit of access to society, to the discourse. We can shift the way that people talk about issues, and I think thinking really intentionally about talking about this as a solvable problem, but also talking about it in a little bit more radical of a way so that we don't lose sight of that joy and dignity aspect to it really matters.